What's up, everybody? Welcome back for episode number 35 of the Blacksburg Buzz. Today, we've got some more updates on the transfer portal. The Hokies have been hitting it really hard, and we're going to talk about a couple of the new additions to the coaching staff, just real briefly for the Hokies on the ladies basketball side. So let's go ahead and jump into some new women's basketball players that have added into the bunch. First one, Ramia White, a freshman 6'5" center. Now, oddly enough, she was actually headed to Kentucky originally, but with the coaching change happening in March to April, she opened up her recruitment once again, and White is finding herself here in Blacksburg next year. So certainly welcome to have her and, adding the first true center to the roster for the 24-25 season for Tech. So at 6'5", she's going to add a lot of size to this team. They're a bit smaller than they were last year in some areas, without Liz Kitley and Clara Strack, but White adds plenty of size. I think she's the same height as Strack, so definitely a good addition there down low. We've also added Lonnie White from Utah, a 5'11" guard, averaged 2.5 points per game last year. She played 10 minutes per game, was in 34 games last season. So going into her junior year, we could see her take a big jump. She'll probably be playing, a more significant role, I would think, with the Hokies, as they have quite a few freshmen on this lineup, and, could see her jump into a more standard role where we see her, closer to that 15, maybe up to 20 minutes per game. We'll have to see what happens, but, real quick guard that they're adding there from Utah with some pretty good experience at a young age, so that's going to be another help as well. And then Kale Peterson, freshman, 6-foot wing. She's number 68 in the 2024 class on Hoops Girls. So, talented young player added on to the Hokies lineup. I think she could make a big impact, and, just getting some minutes, getting adjusted to the college scene, it's going to be a big deal for her. Kale is a good shooter, so that's definitely going to help the Hokies offense. They've been pretty reliant on shooting a good three ball lately and just quick and agile. So she's definitely going to help the team as well. Now, before we talk about some more players that we've added on, I wanted to mention today's video sponsor, Bet Online. It's your number one source for all your summer sports this season, from the MLB, golf, NBA, and NHL playoff stats. All the latest stats, news, and scores available to follow your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. Make sure you head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Bet Online, where the game starts. So, including those three players, there's two more that we did talk about recently on the podcast. We added Layla Wells, a freshman, and Maya Hazelton reaffirmed her commitment for the Hokies. So, quite a few freshmen there. That's 4 freshmen already, just that we've talked about today. So a little bit of a young team. Then you'll have Wenzel as a redshirt sophomore. You'll have Samaya Suffren as a sophomore. Lonnie White's a junior, and then you got a couple seniors. You've got Matilda Eck, you've got Rose Mishaw. I mean, there's a lot of variety on this team, and it's going to be a really new squad in a lot of ways. It's going to have to test things and just kind of get figured out what's going on. You're losing a lot of your centerpieces for this Hokies team. So I think once they figure it out, they could be really good. I mean, they've got a lot of speed here, and they're starting to pull in some more players. A little worrying with numbers earlier, but, with the coaching change and trying to recruit and stuff, it's completely understandable. But at this point, Megan Duffy's pulled in quite a few players and some really good ones as well. Still hoping that we can get one of her Marquette transfers. There is a big one out there in the portal. Liza Carlin was all Big East first team last year. So I assume with Duffy and her relationship, I would think it would be pretty good with her playing more than one season there at Marquette. So if the Hokies can pull in Carlin, that would be huge. I mean, that would be a really big grab for this team. You're pulling an established star in the league, whereas you have a lot of up and coming stars, and then, Misha and Eck are, I would say, stars on this team as well, or at least could be next year. We didn't get to see too much of Misha, but she was really good. So we could see a little bit more of a resurgence from here next year. You don't have Strack and Liz Kitley down low, so a little bit different feeling with her in her last season of eligibility. She's a lot more experienced than a lot of the players on this team. I think we could see a lot more out of Rose Mishaw in the upcoming year. It felt like she just didn't mesh as well with the lineup that we had, but maybe she will a little bit better with the lineup we're going to have in 24-25. So those are all the players that the women's side has added recently. They've brought in 3 new assistant coaches under Duffy over the past couple weeks. Itoro Coleman from UNC, Sharni Zoll Norman from Penn State, and Jen Hoover from Kentucky. So I think those 3, they're going to add a lot to this team. They are very, very experienced. We're talking 20 to 30 years each in coaching roles at predominantly the D1 level. So a lot of experience on this coaching staff. I think they could put together a really good season. We'll just have to see how, everything falls into place. But I really do have a lot of trust in this team and this staff, just from what I've read, what I've heard, kind of the buzz around campus. I do think that it could be a really good season for Hokies women's basketball, despite, a month or two ago thinking that that was kind of it. When you lose a head coach and you lose a lot of really talented star players that you've kind of just been foundational to a program, but bringing in a lot of good transfers, it seems like Duffy is in a really good position to keep the ball rolling and hopefully improve off of where we were. So I do feel optimistic about next year. Now on the men's side, a similar thing. It was a disappointing year. I can't say that it wasn't expected where we were at by the end of the season, but at the same time, it was still a little bit disappointing. You were hoping Tech was going to put the pieces together at some point. It felt like there were a lot of really good pieces on that team, but they never meshed and really became what we hoped they could become. But a lot of players have transferred out and some are out of eligibility. So this is looking like a very, very different roster next year. From what I can sense and what some people that know far more about the sport than I do, is that this team could fit much better with Mike Young's system. Pulled in a lot of different players that play a little bit differently than the players we had before, and perhaps that works really well next year. Obviously uncertain moving ahead with, so many new players, a new team. Definitely going to have to build up the chemistry this next year. There's only 4 players that are returning from last year's team, and 2 of them were freshmen, and Patrick Wessler didn't get a lot of minutes. And then you've got Poteet, who was one of the more established players on the team. He kind of had his chunk of minutes pretty blocked off. He was fairly consistent there, closing in on like a 20-minute, 15 minutes per game. Around that mark is what he was typically there for. So he played quite a bit, but Jaden Young didn't get too much, especially early in the season, being a freshman and all. Rex Steiner played quite a bit in like the early middle segment of the year, but then he saw his time drop off a lot as we went later into the season. And then Patrick Wessler didn't really get many opportunities last year at all. So perhaps they have some chemistry remaining from the last season and practice squads and the few minutes that they would have played together, but generally a very new squad. We already mentioned Ben Burnham transferring from Charleston and Rodney Brown Jr. coming over from Cal. Now, before we get into the players we've added, we did lose a couple. So, Jordan Ivy Curry, who we had just recently gotten in the transfer portal just this spring after the season, he decided in the past about week to go back into the portal and reopen his decision process. He, for whatever reason, decided that Tech wasn't the place that was best for him. And you have to respect that decision, obviously. There's nothing you can do about it. A little bit of an interesting situation. He's been in the transfer portal a lot. He's bounced around quite a bit over his time in collegiate basketball. And it does kind of suck because obviously he was a guy that we were really looking forward to having next year. Thought he could explode for the Hokies in Mike Young's system, but he decided this wasn't best for him, and so we don't know where he'll be going, but it won't be in Blacksburg next year. Another player we lost, we kind of knew it was coming for a little while now, but Sean Padula finally made his decision. He's headed over to Ole Miss, so we won't have Padula back next year. He did mention, right when he went into the portal, that he was considering coming back in the 24-25 season to Virginia Tech. He wasn't certain, though, and he was going to try out the portal and see what came up. He went on quite a few visits in the last week or two, is what I had heard around, and eventually settled on Ole Miss just recently, so he'll be over there. So Tech went ahead and picked up Toby Lawal from VCU, 6'8" forward, and this dude is a freak athlete. I mean, Lawal, he has some hops on him. It's insane to watch. I would strongly recommend you check out some highlights from him because we're talking, somewhere along his face all the way at rim level. This guy can jump. He is a monster athlete. He's going to be a big addition to this team. A little bit raw from everything I've seen, as he needs to refine his game a little bit, but he's got some tools there. So Lawal, 8 points per game last year, 6 rebounds for VCU. He was efficient as a shooter, doing a lot in the paint. Nice defender as well, which is going to be solid. Good block numbers and such. So he's definitely going to add a lot to the Hokies' defensive side of things and potentially the offense as well. Just with being the athlete that he is, I think he could make a really big difference on this team. It almost reminds me of, in terms of like the Hokies team, sort of like Mekhi Long last year. He was kind of that crazy athlete for Tech, in my opinion. Now, their games might be a little bit different and whatnot, but in terms of Tech's team last year, he's the closest comparison I could make, as Long was a crazy athlete. I mean, he could really get up. He was quick. So I think Lawal is going to add a lot to this team because when Mekhi Long was out, Tech really took a dip last year. Now, like we said earlier, you do have a completely different team for the most part. So will it be the same dip if Lawal isn't playing or not compared to when Long was out from last year's team? Can't say that for certain. But he was a player that when he was in, Tech was much better than when he was out on the bench. So this could be a really good sign for Tech in the 24-25 season. In addition, Heisier Miller is coming from Temple, 6'1" guard, 16 points per game, 3.5 rebounds, 4 assists. He wasn't a great shooter at Temple, but it looks like he might see a pretty big jump in his game with Virginia Tech. Temple had a pretty poor offense altogether, and potentially playing with a team that could have a higher ceiling than Temple, maybe we see just with his less of a need for him to score and shoot the ball and such, and a little bit of pressure off of him, perhaps his numbers could go up a little bit just with a better offensive team and an offensive system with Mike Young. So Miller shot the three about 30%, and from the field, he was a little bit less efficient than you'd like, but perhaps with a Mike Young offense and what could be a Hokies team with a little bit higher ceiling than Temple was, they were much, much higher in the net rankings and such than Temple was. I believe Temple was down in like the low 200s, and Tech for a lot of the season was in that like high 60s range. So perhaps with a better team, Miller could see a little bit better, more consistent offense from him and just shoot the ball a little bit better. Another area that he could add for this crew is he's a little bit better on defense than guards from last year, and he has a slightly better in terms of ball security as well on the offensive side. So those are two things that whether they're just or not, in your opinion, there have been a lot of gripes against Hokies guards in the last couple of seasons about those two things, and Miller could add a little bit of improvement to that area, and hopefully people are appreciative of that. So all in all, Ramia White, Lonnie White, Cale Peterson join the women's side, along with Layla Wells and Maya Hazelton, who we knew about earlier, and Heisier Miller and Toby Lawal join, while we've lost Ivy Curry and Padula, and then we already talked about Ben Burnham and Rodney Brown Jr. So definitely building up some good squads on the men's and the women's side. Looking forward to the 2024-25 basketball season because there's just been a lot of turnover, and I think there's a lot to be excited about. There's a lot of unknowns with so much just new in terms of both these programs, but it does appear like there's a lot to be excited about, and I just want to remain optimistic, if possible, about this team next year, because you can't knock them until we've seen how this team performs for a little bit. Give them a couple games into the season, and we'll see how things are, and at that point, then we can reevaluate if things are going south. But for the meantime, I feel like it's reasonable to remain optimistic and just be excited, because it seems, at least, that things in Tech sports are doing pretty decently. Now, the baseball team, they've been struggling a little bit recently, but softball is fantastic. There's a lot of hype around this Hokies football team coming into next season. And then with all this turnover around the basketball squad, and originally it felt pretty bad just when you're losing so much, so many people. It feels bad right when it hits you because you go, well, what are we going to do? But at this point, it seems like they figured it out pretty well. There's a couple scholarships open on both teams. There's like 2 or 3, maybe 1 on the men's and the women's side. So somewhere around the 4 or 5 mark combined. But when you look at it a week or 2 ago, they had like 5 open on either side. So they're getting the job done. They're pulling in good transfers, good recruits, and I think there's just a lot to be excited about this time around. Now, in case you missed it, I'd really recommend you go back to last episode. That one was a lot of fun for me. I've heard some great stuff from a couple listeners on that Ethan Agagi interview. He's a really cool dude, really cool story. I mean, grew up in Guam and got into wrestling around the high school time frame. Went over to Michigan for college, then trained at Penn State for a little bit, and came to Virginia Tech to come work here at the SERTC. That's the Southeast Regional Training Center, where a lot of the best NCAA wrestlers in the country train at, because, Virginia Tech has built up a really great wrestling program. So Ethan's been working there. He functions as the wrestling SID for them. So all of their social media posts and whatnot, that's Ethan. And, he's just an awesome guy and an awesome story. He's been to Olympic trials several times, working on representing Guam. He's run into some difficulties at those, but, maybe, he said maybe he could be back for 2028. He couldn't go to the qualifier this year because he was working the NCAA tournament with the team. So he couldn't go for 2024, but perhaps he'll be back for 28. We don't know. But just an awesome guy, awesome story, and just a really cool thing to learn about. I feel like wrestling doesn't get quite as much coverage as a lot of the other sports, and I think a lot of that comes down to just people not being as familiar with wrestling. And I myself am one of them. I never wrestled growing up at all, and I had a couple friends do it, but it wasn't really something that I picked up on and I was around much. And so just learning a little bit more about that, it was really fun. It's a really great interview. I'd encourage you to listen to that one. And once again, just thank you guys for tuning into the Blacksburg Buzz. Another great episode sponsored by Bet Online. So make sure you stay tuned. Got some good ones coming up. We'll be covering perhaps a little bit of Virginia Tech football just ahead of the summer. We've seen some transfers come in and out, a couple big ones. So that's going to be exciting, and, just the hype surrounding this team going into next year, and then just continued coverage of baseball and softball. We're getting really close to the postseason. So, that's going to be super fun. So make sure you tune in for those. Once again, sponsored by Bet Online, and we will see you guys next time.